Hey guys, tonight we return to the shadow of crumbling ziggurats and the slow whispering wind of the Sumerian plain. Moonlight falls in silver streaks over toppled bricks, pooling in the cracks like molten stars. The air tastes faintly of salt and dust, and somewhere in the distance, a fox darts across an alley that hasn't seen a merchant in 4,000 years. You probably won't survive this. Well, you would if you could, but trust me, there's a reason most people who tried to read these flood tablets didn't exactly sleep well afterward. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across the broken courtyard, past weeds that sway like the ghost of an ancient harvest. The air is cooler now, the day's heat sunk into the ground, leaving behind that faint baked brick scent that clings to forgotten cities. Somewhere, buried beneath centuries of collapsed walls, lies the temple archive, the place the flood story began. Your fingers brush along walls etched with faint lines, the ancient cuneiform dulled by wind-blown grit, but still holding their stubborn shapes like the memories of the stones themselves. Historians still argue whether these tablets were intended as literal accounts, political allegories, or ceremonial myths to explain the unpredictable wrath of the rivers. But standing here, you can almost feel the weight of the story pressing from the ground up, as if the earth itself remembers. A fragment catches your eye, half buried, sunken in the rubble. Clay hardened to stone, its wedge-shaped marks deep enough to survive empires. You kneel, brushing away the dust, revealing rows of careful script. This isn't one of the famous fragments already in museums. No, this one still smells faintly of the earth that kept it hidden, like a secret reluctant to be told. A shape flickers in your mind, not an image you see, but something you feel. A vast plain under darkening skies, a river swelling, the horizon bending under a weight it was never meant to hold. You blink, and the sensation vanishes, leaving you with nothing but the cold clay in your hand. Maybe you're just tired, or maybe the old stories have a way of stepping closer when you dare to touch them. Above you, the moon slips behind a cloud, and the ruins seem to lean in, as if the city is listening. Somewhere in the depths of the archive, deeper than the collapse, there will be more tablets, still sleeping, still holding the tale of the waters that once came without mercy. You take a step forward, the crunch of gravel under your heel sounding louder than it should in the silence, and in that moment, you realize you're not alone here. The presence is subtle at first, like the faint shift of air when someone moves behind you. You turn, scanning the shadowed courtyard, but there's nothing but the skeletal outline of walls against the night sky. Then you catch it, the soft scrape of something on stone, measured and deliberate, coming from deeper within the ruins. You follow the sound, slipping through a narrow archway where the brick has sagged into a jagged grin. Inside, the air changes, cooler, denser, with the faint scent of clay and reed mats long turned to dust. Torchlight would have danced here once, catching the gold and ceremonial plaques. Now, only the moon finds its way in through collapsed sections of roof. And there, hunched among the leaning stacks of tablets, is the keeper of clay. His robes are patched and heavy with dust, the hem whispering over the floor as he moves. His face is mapped with the same lines as the tablets he guards, eyes like two dark wells where stories sink and vanish. You try a greeting, but he simply raises one hand, gesturing for silence. With a gnarled finger, he points to a shelf, a precarious set of wooden slats held together by what might once have been copper nails. Upon it rests a tablet the size of your chest, its surface carved with lines so precise they seem to drink in the light. He doesn't pick it up. Instead, he brushes it gently with a reed brush, sweeping away a thin layer of powder. "This one," he murmurs, voice like river silt, "tells how it began." His Sumerian is ancient, but the cadence carries meaning even before you understand the words. He explains that this archive holds not just royal records, but the bones of memory, accounts written by survivors, scribes, and even those who claimed the gods spoke directly into their dreams. A mainstream historical fact slips in here. The flood story you think you know, Utnapishtim's ark, the raging waters, comes from multiple versions, etched across Mesopotamia in Akkadian and Sumerian alike, some older than the Epic of Gilgamesh. Yet, he says, the one in front of you predates them all. The keeper leans closer, almost conspiratorial. This one speaks of things the others omit, the sky's first warnings and the voices beneath the river. His words hang there, tasting of damp stone and unspoken rules. You feel an urge to touch the tablet, but his hand darts out, stopping you inches away. Not yet, he says. First, you must hear the shape of the words. Only then will the clay speak. And with that, he begins to recite, each phrase rolling like water over stone, low and steady. As he speaks, the walls seem to breathe. The shadows in the corners stretch just a little farther. You picture a scribe millennia ago, crouched over wet clay, reed stylus in hand, glancing nervously toward the door as if afraid the river itself might come barging in. Historians still argue whether keepers like him were mere archivists or initiated into temple secrets known only to high priests. But as you listen, you can't shake the thought that this man has stood in this room far longer than one lifetime should allow. And if he hasn't, well, maybe the tablets are the ones keeping him here. The recitation ends abruptly, the sound cut off as if someone closed a door in your mind. He exhales, the dust in the air swirling with his breath, and nods toward a narrow stairwell plunging deeper underground. If you want to know what the flood tablets really said, he tells you, you must follow the river into the dark. Your foot hovers over the first step. Somewhere below, you swear you hear the faint lap of water. The steps are uneven, worn into shallow bowls by countless feet long gone to dust. You descend slowly, hand brushing the wall for balance. The air grows damp, clinging to your skin with the faint tang of river silt. Somewhere ahead, water drips, slow, patient, unbothered by centuries. At the bottom, the passage opens into a chamber that smells like rain-soaked earth. Clay tablets are stacked in careful columns, each wrapped in reed matting. In the center, on a low altar of blackened wood, lies one without any wrapping, as if it refuses to be hidden. Its surface glimmers faintly in the half-light, filtering through a crack in the ceiling, like wet stone even though it's dry to the touch. The keeper steps beside you, his shadow long against the wall. This, he says, is the first warning ever written, not for a king, not for the priests, for anyone who could read. You trace the rows of wedges with your eyes, imagining the stylus pressing in, line after deliberate line. The text begins with the sky. It speaks of a veil over the sun, not an eclipse, but a slow dimming over many days. Birds flew in restless spirals, livestock refused to graze, and the river's surface mirrored a strange copper hue. Mainstream historians might call it poetic exaggeration, a scribe's way of dramatizing a coming storm season. But the lines are too precise, describing weather shifts in a sequence eerily consistent with what modern science calls rapid climate events. Then comes the part the museums rarely translate in full. The voices in the reed beds grew louder, it says, as if the river itself spoke with the tongues of the drowned. The keeper's tone is even, but you sense this is the passage he respects most. Fringe scholars claim such lines are coded references to seismic vibrations carrying through the water, an early description of an approaching cataclysm. Others believe it's exactly what it sounds like, the dead whispering through the currents. Historians still argue whether the Sumerians interpreted these phenomena as literal omens or symbolic portents. But standing here, with the sound of dripping water echoing softly, you can almost believe in both. The narrative shifts. It describes a wind that carried no scent and nights where stars swam like fish beneath the clouds. Farmers recorded failing harvests in tablet margins. Fishermen noted the river yielding strange, pale fish never seen before. Each observation feels like another bead on a string, leading toward something inevitable. You realize the warning wasn't just about water. It was about time. The text suggests that the days would shorten and the moons would lengthen, an impossible statement if taken literally, yet haunting in its metaphorical weight, time itself bending before the flood's arrival. The keeper watches your face as you read, as if gauging whether you'll laugh, shiver, or dismiss it entirely. The warnings are not for the past, he says softly. They are for whoever finds them next. You glance back toward the stairwell, the faint silver of moonlight barely touching the top steps. The thought settles in. If the first lines on the first tablet could feel this urgent across 4 millennia, what will the rest demand of you? The keeper turns away, moving toward another alcove. The river god spoke after the sky dimmed, he says. You'll want to hear that part too. And once again, the air feels heavier, as though it knows what's coming. You follow the keeper into a side tunnel that curls like a reed stem, and the farther you go, the more the walls glisten. The air turns cool and wet, that clean mineral chill you only get where water sits in the dark and decides to think about you. Somewhere ahead, a low rush begins, not loud but constant, like a long exhale behind a door. The floor dips. Your sandals slip once on bitumen-slick stone. Yes, the same sticky stuff from the ziggurat steps. Consider this a reunion you didn't ask for. And then the passage opens into a chamber no larger than a city room, cut low and rounded as a bowl. At its center lies a sunken pool rimmed by black bricks stamped with a barely visible rosette. A thin sheet of water slides over the lip and disappears into a slit along the floor, a sound like a whisper dragged through teeth. Reed bundles hang drying from pegs. A copper ladle rests on a hook, and on a niche shelf, a row of tiny clay fish, each with a hole drilled where the mouth should be, stare forever at whoever kneels here. This was the dreaming place, the keeper says, voice softer, as if the water can hear what you think about it. Fresh water from the Abzu ran beneath the temple. The priest listened. Mainstream historical fact to anchor your crawl through the damp. Mesopotamian temples often sat atop marshy ground or tapped canals with substructures that brought cool groundwater into precincts. The god Enki, to later tongues, ruled the sweet waters of the Abzu, and his priests, the Ashipu, served as ritual specialists and diagnosticians, interpreting omens from dreams, livers, smoke, and yes, sometimes water. Oath-taking and oracular rites could involve basins, outflows, and whispered petitions poured into jars. The keeper kneels and touches the surface with 2 fingers. Circles move outward, then fold back in, then vanish like a secret that changed its mind. When the sky dimmed, he says, they asked the river to speak. He points to a tablet set into the wall just above waterline, its face protected by a thin crust of mineral bloom. The lines are brief, almost breathy. We set reeds, tied with wool, before the Abzu. The stream refused the north gate and pressed the east. Voices came in the foam. You test the words in your mouth and get the taste of copper. The priests must have watched the eddies the way sky watchers follow stars, which way the current leaned, what it carried, how bubbles broke. A fringe tradition peeks out from the niche like a cat. Those hollow-mouthed fish? Some say they were clay ears. You set them in the outflow so the water's murmur spoke through them. Others say the holes held reeds and the current made a voice when it pushed air. You can imagine it, a low flute, a vowel dragged thin, the kind of sound a frightened mind could turn into a sentence. The keeper neither endorses nor scoffs. He just breathes with the room. Ya, on the second night, he recites from memory, the water sang a name we did not know. On the third, it sang the cities. There's a scratch at the bottom margin of the wall tablet, someone's impatient stylus jab. You picture a young scribe, knees aching on wet stone, trying to keep up as the old priest murmurs every swirl and splash into words. You also picture the scribe's later smirk upstairs, labeling this room miscellaneous water noises. You see you're back to imagining his attitude. It's become a habit. The keeper opens a reed basket and takes out a hard, black lump that smells faintly of pine and something sweet. Incense. He sets it on a shallow dish, strikes a spark from flint, and soon a clear thread of smoke climbs, then drifts sideways toward a slit in the wall where the outflow runs. They read the water, they read the smoke, he says. 2 tongues, 1 answer. You remember the ziggurat's terrace and the Libanomancy whispers, smoke bending as a sign. Down here, the air pulls the thread into a thin curve, then another, then a sudden tremble as a draft kicks in from the hidden channel. Historians still argue whether these undertemple channels were primarily drainage, air conditioning for the gods, or acoustic trickery designed to make the Abzu seem alive. You add a quieter possibility. Maybe the engineers wanted everything, coolth, cleanliness, and a stage for wonder. The line between plumbing and prayer is narrow when a city survives by water. You kneel and dip the copper ladle. The water is colder than your expectations, and your palm hums from the chill. The keeper nods toward a narrow tablet, its edges scalloped where fingers once worried them smooth. Petitions, he says. People came when the river forgot their field, when fever took a child, when a dream wouldn't unstick. The Ashipu chanted, poured, watched. On the little tablet, the words stack like held breath. We poured barley grain and sesame oil. The stream rejected oil, it lifted grain. We dredged the east ditch, and the fever broke on the second dawn. It's easy to roll your eyes at a correlation drawn with incense and hope. It's also easy to remember the breach crew by the Euphrates, that frantic hour when mud and reed and prayer made a wall. Maybe the water said east ditch because the east ditch needed dredging. Maybe the priests were Sumer's customer support for rivers. Joke one, you'll allow it. At the pool's rim, a set of 7 small pegs stands in a line. Each is scored with tiny notches. The keeper taps the 4th. The sound rings dull, a different density. On storm nights, he says, they set stretched cord across these and counted the beats between drops. The pattern said how far the floodwater had roared in the channels below. An ancient rain gauge, disguised as a ritual xylophone. You're half tempted to play something. You resist. Joke 2. No one needs to hear your greatest hits of "Please Don't Flood My House" in D minor. He gestures toward a painted panel flaking from the curve of the ceiling, reeds bending under blue strokes of rain, a small boat of bundled stalks, a figure with one hand to the water and one to the sky. The caption, almost lost, reads, "Do not set one hand only." You file it with other Sumerian advice that sounds like therapy. Balance, ask the river, check the sky, pray and shovel. Another tablet waits in a recess, half sunk into silt. You pry it free gently, and mud threads pull like old silk. The text is blunt. The Abzu warned 7 days, black wind, ash in rain. We sealed jars, we sealed roof, we sealed boat. Mainstream fact, flood instructions in Mesopotamian lore list sealing with bitumen as the essential step for boats, baskets, even house doors during storms. The black wind sends you back to the first warning upstairs, the veil over the sun, copper sky. Volcanic haze, dust storm, fire upstream. Historians still argue whether these phrases describe local river fury or an echo of greater cataclysms stitched into local memory. Quirky Tidbit slips its head up again. A tiny clay plaque near the floor shows a fish with legs. It's not fine art. It's charmingly weird. Someone scratched beside it. He walked to tell us the sluice was stuck. Your brain offers 3 options: children, joking scribes, or an omen report gone delightfully literal. Either way, you grin, and the room does not smite you. Joke 3. If a fish ever knocks on your door with maintenance requests, you're officially on temple duty. You sit back on your heels and listen. The Abzu's run is steadier now, or maybe your breath finally matched it. The keeper closes his eyes. They argued here, he says. Not just prayers. How many baskets to the upstream banks? Which canal to cut? Whether to lift the city's granary ration 2 cups for the week. The gods were not offended by arithmetic. A last tablet, thin, curved from drying too fast, lists names and assignments for reed cutting, dredging, roof repairs, and, interestingly, lullaby singers scheduled at the key. The line makes you blink. The keeper notices. Sound calms workers and gods, he says. And children. You picture the night the river rose, and a clear voice carried over mud and rope, keeping hands steady. Sleep and song as flood technology. File that beside beer and bitumen. When you stand, your knees crackle like old papyrus. The chamber's ceiling drip finds its interval again. 1, 2, 3. You count to 7 without meaning to. The keeper watches your lips move and gives the smallest nod. You hear it, he says. Good. You'll need the beat when we talk about the boat. You wipe a damp palm on your robe and glance at the clay fish, the pegs, the smoke thread fading into the slit. Up above, the city is all dust and story. Down here, the river still writes in the margins. You can walk away calling this superstition engineering or art, but as you follow the keeper back toward the stair, you know you've added a 4th word to the set. Listening. The flood tablets are not trying to be dramatic. They're trying to be heard in time. The air warms as the tunnel rises. Behind you, the Abzu mutters once, like a thought completing itself. You feel the answer you haven't asked settle in your ribs. The river spoke, and the priests spoke back, and between them they kept a city breathing one more season. When you step into the archive light, the keeper is already turning a corner toward a rack labeled with a single wedge. Boat. You follow, dripping slightly, ready for the part where wood is not the point. The keeper leads you through a low arch, and the smell hits first, aged cedar, resin, and the faint ghost of river mud baked into the grain. You emerge into a hall lined with long, narrow shelves, each stacked with bundles of reed drawings, timber measurements etched into clay, and curious lumps of hardened pitch. Your sandals scuff over a floor paved in mismatched bricks, each marked with a single wedge as though signed by a very minimalist scribe. At the far end stands a wall relief of a boat unlike any you've seen in modern harbors. Its hull high and round like a half-moon tipped on its side, the deck crowned with a small cabin, and the bow painted with the great staring eye of a god. "The reed ark," the keeper says without ceremony. "Before the flood, the river spoke. We listened. We built. Here's your mainstream anchor. Archaeologists know Mesopotamians built reed boats coated in bitumen, sometimes large enough for trade along the Persian Gulf. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes Utnapishtim's craft, a cube-like vessel sealed against the coming deluge, and even earlier Sumerian flood tales echo the same construction details. The texts mention precise dimensions, materials, and the obsessive act of sealing every seam until it gleamed like obsidian in the sun. The keeper runs a palm over a great black brick of hardened bitumen, its surface scratched with notes. 3 coats for hull, 2 for roof. Seal until the smell fills the street. He smirks slightly. If you smelled it for a week, you did it right. If you smelled it for a month, you did it twice. You can't help but imagine the entire city perfumed with the scent of asphalt before asphalt was a thing. Joke 1. The world's first neighborhood complaint about construction odors. Against one wall, a tablet the size of a small door leans on a cradle. Its top is carved with a crescent moon and 6 small dots, likely the star cluster we call the Pleiades. Beneath is the text, "The moon watched, the 7 sang. We tied the first rope when the crane's shadow stood on the gate." A mix of astrology and project management. You have to admire the commitment. But here's where the fringe belief sidles in. Some later traditions claim the boat designs weren't just functional, they were modeled on celestial symbols. The arc of the hull echoed the curve of the sky, the cabin marked as the navel of the heavens, and the great eye painted on the prow to ward off chaos demons swimming in the deep. Was it superstition or a form of visual prayer to keep the cosmos itself from tipping during the storm? Historians still argue whether this was symbolic art or an earnest belief that the boat was a microcosm of the world. You move to a set of small clay models, their hulls varying in shape and seal. Some have no cabin at all, others feature elaborate lattice roofs. One model, no larger than your forearm, has grooves etched along its base, water channels, or perhaps a way to measure flow when tested in a pool. You imagine a line of boat builders squatting by the Abzu, pushing models back and forth like children with toy rafts, reading the way water curled around each design. Joke 2, ancient R&D looked a lot like recess. The keeper hands you a fragment half covered in pitch. The cuneiform reads, "We cut cedar from the east, date palm from the marsh. We bent reed in the sun until it sang. We drove nails of copper where the rope would bite." The poetry of construction is in the verbs. They cut, bent, drove, sealed. No talk of if the flood would come, just when and how to be ready. A shelf to your left holds jars of small rounded stones. The keeper explains. Ballast. And sometimes offerings. Stones from the holy hills to steady the boat. Stones from a rival city to sink their luck. The line between physics and pettiness seems timeless. A long tablet in the center of the room draws your attention. It's a checklist, each line ending with a wedge mark. Seal east seam, test roof latch, count rations, lead animals, seal again. You notice seal again appears 6 separate times. That obsessive redundancy makes sense when you remember the flood stories always stress bitumen, as if it were the actual magic keeping chaos at bay. Quirky tidbit time. One tiny tablet here records that during one boat's construction, a goat kept eating the bundled reeds. The scribe notes they invited the goat aboard after the flood receded. Whether as thanks or as punishment, the tablet doesn't say. You decide it's the origin story for ship's mascot. Joke 3. At least they didn't let the goat near the bitumen. The keeper motions you toward a darker alcove where an enormous timber beam rests on 2 stone supports. Its surface is covered in faint carvings, fish, birds, stars, and a row of human figures holding hands. Keel of the teaching boat, he says, not for sailing, only for remembering. He runs his hand along the wood as if tracing the length of a story. They built it so the children would learn to tie rope, to seal, to listen to the water. Every year before the rains, they practiced. Historians still debate whether the flood narratives preserved in these tablets refer to a single catastrophic event, perhaps a massive river flood or Black Sea deluge, or whether they're mythologized memories of many smaller disasters woven together over generations. Standing here, the question feels smaller than the answer. Whatever the cause, the response was the same. Build. Prepare. Listen. Near the exit, you find a peculiar half-tablet. Only one phrase remains. The boat is the answer the river understands. You think of the Abzu's murmurs, the smoke drifting toward the slit, the 7th peg's dull tone, the sealing and resealing until the whole city reeked of safety. The keeper doesn't rush you, but when you turn, he's already moving toward the next aisle, one labeled with a single wedge that means sky. Your footsteps follow before your mind catches up. Boats and skies, apparently in Sumer, you needed to master both to survive the waters. You tip your head back, and the ceiling of the world has the color of unripe olives, too dark for morning, too smothered for night. The first wind arrives flat and tasteless, like air that forgot the recipe for scent. It comes from nowhere and everywhere at once, sliding under doors, nosing into the reed mats, pressing the small hairs on your arms the wrong way. You hold your breath without meaning to, as if saving it for later. The keeper doesn't speak. He opens a narrow case and lifts a thin, soot-dark tablet with edges scorched and glassy. 7 days, he says. Black sky. The wedges run tight and shallow, like a voice forced to whisper during a storm. You read as the room seems to dim, the words a drumbeat. On the first day, the wind carried ash. On the second, the sun turned to copper. On the third, men lit lamps at noon and saw their hands as strangers. Mainstream history gives you a handhold. In the Akkadian flood tradition preserved inside Gilgamesh, the hurricane rages 6 days and 7 nights, the storm god's fury blotting out dawn. Here in the older clay, the count shifts but the feeling does not. The world goes lid shut. Farmers on the canal banks tie ropes from house to house so they can walk in darkness without losing each other. Fishermen lash their boats to masonry rings and sit with their palms on the hulls, measuring the river's anger by its tremor. Scribes record day without sun with a careful lack of metaphor. On the 4th day, the tablet says, the rain fell without sound. You blink at that, then notice the gloss where droplets once struck with such force they melted a skin of clay, glass freckles frozen mid-splash. The keeper runs a fingertip over them, a small, reverent gesture. Hot, he murmurs, or carrying something that burned. You think of distant volcanoes and deserts emptying their lungs. Historians still argue whether these lines encode a single huge event, ash on the wind from far away, or the cumulative memory of dust storms and river storms married by poetry into one long black week. Lamps appear in the next entries. The priests order them kept at every corner, fish oil, sesame oil, even rancid jars dragged from the back of storerooms. The city glows in small islands, doorways like moons, courtyards like constellations. Children are told the darkness is a cloak for the river god while he works. Anxious parents repeat it until the lie turns into lullaby. You write the line in your head to remember later because it's almost sweet, and because sweetness is rationed now. You step outside into what the tablet names Day 5. and the sky is a lid you could wrap with your knuckles. Dust slips into your teeth with every breath. The ziggurat steps, already treacherous on a good day, gleam wet with weeping bitumen. It strings into tiny threads if you dare touch it, which you don't. Joke 1. You've lost one sandal to bitumen already this lifetime. You're not feeding it a sequel. Somewhere, a goat bleats in a voice you recognize. The construction site reed chewer has been promoted to house guest, and it dislikes the weather like everyone else. On a ledge, a scribe, your old smirker, presses a tablet with steady hands, lamp shielded by a scrap of cloth. He's recording unusual fish, grain sprouting in storehouse floors, eyes stinging, dreams full of smoke. He adds a practical line, seal jars again. The word again arrives 6 times, as if repetition were a ritual. Maybe it is. Inside the temple precinct, the Ashipu line up polished bowls of water beneath skylights. Even with lamps burning, the bowls look like holes cut in the floor, the surfaces darker than thought. The men watch for signs, the way ash falls and dissolves, the path a fleck takes, drifting toward the slit east or west, the ring that forms around a drop of pitch. You remember the Abzu's 7 pegs and count between drips now out of habit. The rhythm keeps your breath from climbing your throat. Quirky, maybe, but not ridiculous. One fringe tablet describes sky flowers, flaky, feathery clumps drifting down, so light they seem to swim sideways. A note in the margin says a child chased them with outstretched hands, laughing, until her mother pulled her indoors by the braid. The scribe calls them ashbirds and draws 3 wobbly ones in the corner. Another tablet promises, bathe in beer to soothe the eyes. You decide that's advice dressed as wishful thinking. Joke 2. Medicinal beer is the best medical advice you've heard tonight. You volunteer as test subject after this is over. By day 6, the sound arrives, a thick animal moan running under the city like a second river, low enough to feel in bone. The north wind shoves with both hands, doors bump and shiver in their frames, even the ziggurat seems to hunch its shoulders against the push. Priests divide the hours by drumbeat and send runners to count the lamp islands on assigned streets. A tablet you can barely make out under soot scratches. We lost the baker's boy for 1 hour. He returned, holding a lamp and laughing. He says the darkness is a corridor. You tuck that image away, the idea that night can be a hallway and not a pit. Above the roofs, thunder rolls without lightning. Or maybe the lightning is in the cloud belly, hoarded and private. The river reads as a single band of ink at the city's edge. Even the lamps fail to write their gold into it. Somewhere along the quay, a singer starts a low, steady hymn, the lullaby assignment from the Abzu roster turning out to be a very good idea. Voices join, then drum on jars, then steady foot taps keep time. It doesn't banish fear, but it panels the room you're trapped in with something warmer than worry. There's a broken panel near the archive door where someone tried to draw the sky that week. A line of small circles, sun haunted by halos, then a swath of horizontal strokes, then 7 tall marks like stakes. Underneath, a single wedge. Enough. You stand with your palm on the cold brick and agree with the hand that wrote it, then and now. The 7th day in the tablet's hand lands with a thud. Silence. Not peace, not blue. Just the storm's voice gone as if someone cupped it and carried it away. Lamps burn lower. People crack doors like eyelids. A breeze tries the alleys lightly, like a cat putting weight on a tender paw. Then a sound you didn't know you missed. Wings. A heron beats past, a damp whisper that is secretly the loudest thing you have ever heard. Historians still argue whether a black sky week like this is a stitched memory. Eclipses, dust veils, Syrian storms, braided by generations into one cloth. They argue whether the counts, 6 nights, 7 days, reflect ceremony more than weather. The debate matters, but right now you're staring at lamp smoke curling toward a ceiling you can finally see, and the part your ribs care about is simpler. The world turned off and then on, and in the pause between, people practiced hope like a trade. You walk the lamplit street with the keeper. In the doorways, faces shine with oil and relief. Someone sweeps ash from a sill with ceremonial seriousness, as if uninviting a rude guest. Someone else ladles water over a threshold, the Abzu's old language spoken in a new accent. If the flood comes now, The city will meet it with ropes ready, jars sealed, a goat resigned, and a drummer already counting. On a wall near the quay, a line appears overnight in wet clay. The sky forgot us, then remembered. No signature. Maybe the wind wrote it with a child's hand. Maybe you did, and forgot. Joke 3. If the wind wants credit, it can file a tablet like everyone else. You look up. The lid has thinned to slate. Somewhere behind it the sun is licking its thumb and rubbing at a stain. The river growls a little, less threat than warning. You find the beat again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and hold it like a small, stubborn light. The keeper nods toward the boat hull. If the sky can do that, the water will try. Time to see whether the answer you built can speak the river's language. You follow the keeper down a corridor where the stone is worn smooth by generations of sandaled feet. The air changes, cooler, smelling faintly of pitch, river water, and something metallic like the inside of an old coin. Then the hall opens into the boat chamber, and you understand why the scribes used the word ark, even when they didn't mean the one you grew up hearing about. 5 hulking hulls rest on cradles, each the length of a street, ribbed with cedar beams brought from mountains that exist in rumor more than in map. Between them, narrow channels cut into the floor to guide floodwater in for launch. The biggest has a carved prow shaped like a bull's head, its horns gilded so they gleam even in lamplight. The keeper rests a hand on its jaw as if greeting an old friend. Mainstream historians note that Sumerian flood preparedness wasn't a single story, but a whole culture of readiness. Boats for trade doubling as rescue vessels, reed barges woven tight as baskets, clay anchors stacked like loaves. Here, though, the scale pushes past practicality. The cedar, the horned prow, the inlaid lapis eyes. It's not just transport, it's theater. Maybe devotion, maybe intimidation. A fringe note from one tablet you remember claimed the bull-headed ark was meant to carry the city's breathing treasures, priests, scribes, singers, and the 7 sacred instruments, while another said bluntly it was for livestock, starting with the king's herd. Historians still argue whether these boats were ceremonial, practical, or both. You stand beneath the great rib cage and think it could be either, a floating temple or a very stylish barn. The keeper leads you to a workbench where tools are laid out in 2 neat rows, adzes, drills, chisels on one side, bundles of reeds, clay caulking paddles, jars of bitumen on the other. A scribe leans over a tablet describing kuparu, smearing pitch until water cannot remember the path inside. You touch the jar's rim and feel grit under the sticky black. The smell is sharp, almost medicinal. Joke 1. If you wore this as perfume, you'd never have to worry about crowded markets again. Near the bow, 2 young men are winding thick rope around a wooden spindle. It's not the fiber you expect. It's braided leather, slick and strong, meant to take a strain without fraying. The keeper taps your arm, points upward. Above the arcs, hooks in the beams hold bundles of these ropes, coiled and ready like sleeping snakes. For tying to the ziggurat, he says simply, as though mooring a boat to a temple is the obvious thing to do. And here, maybe it is. In the shadow of the smallest ark, a reed mat is spread with offerings, dates, beer, a tiny carved duck, and next to them, a lump of clay impressed with a child's hand. The tablet beside it reads, "For Ninurta, so he will row fast." You picture the god of war and farming taking up an oar, muscling through the brown floodwater while people cheer from the deck. The image is absurd, comforting, and maybe exactly the point. Joke 2. Divine rowing team. Now that's a sport you'd pay to watch. The keeper waves you over to a dark recess where something leans against the wall under a skin of dust. He draws the cover aside. A steering oar as tall as a man, its blade painted with curling lines that resolve into a river map if you squint. This is no fisherman's tool. It's a declaration. The clay label says it was used once when the water climbed over the second stair, and never since. You can't tell if that's because it wasn't needed or because the memory was too sharp to repeat. A woman in a fringed robe sits cross-legged near the prow, humming as she braids cord. When she glances up, you see she's blind in one eye. She smiles anyway, and you realize she's matching the braid's rhythm to her song. The keeper explains, she's one of the memory keepers, able to recall flood years by the taste of water. She can tell if the river's carrying mountain snow or southern salt just by sipping from a jar. You're not sure if that's science, magic, or just the sort of skill you get when your life depends on noticing the difference. Historians still argue whether such river tasters were real or symbolic, but here she is, humming, working, making you doubt the word symbolic altogether. The tablet you're here to see rests in a niche above the largest ark's bow. Its title wedge reads, "What the waters carried away." The first lines are mundane: grain stores, goats, a brick kiln. Then they tilt: voices, colors, the warmth from a stone bench, a particular laugh. The scribe lists them as if they're as solid as pottery. You think about how floods erase, and how sometimes the loss is in the things you can't weigh. The keeper's gaze follows yours, and for once he looks almost unguarded. Quirky detail. One edge of the tablet has shallow scratches of fish, 3 kinds, drawn with enough detail that a modern ichthyologist could probably identify them. Some believe these were warnings, species that swim upriver only when the flood is higher than the temple wall. Others think they're just idle doodles by a bored apprentice. You'd like to believe both, an apprentice whose boredom accidentally helped predict a disaster. Joke 3, world's first accidental meteorologist didn't even get a raise. The chamber's far wall holds murals of past launches. In one, priests scatter barley into rising water while musicians play tall drums. In another, women in embroidered dresses hand jars to men on the deck. The faces are stylized but serene. No panic, no rush, just the choreography of people who have rehearsed this for centuries. The keeper's voice is low when he says, "It's coming." You think he means the flood, but his eyes are on a point over your shoulder. You turn, and there it is, a dark thread creeping under the heavy door, spreading into a small, deliberate pool. It smells of silt and distance. Somewhere above, a gong rings once. Workers drop tools, sling ropes, check knots. The blind-eyed singer ties off her braid and rises without hurry. The keeper closes the tablet niche and lays his palm flat on the cedar prow. You find yourself doing the same, and the wood is warm, as if it has been waiting its turn to breathe. The water curls closer. The keeper nods toward the ramp that leads up into the ark's belly. "We'll read the rest on the water," he says. And just like that, the chamber is motion, every practiced gesture unfolding as if the tablets themselves had been giving quiet orders all along. The ramp groans under your feet, wood answering water with a sound like a long, tired yawn. The blind-eyed singer slips past you with a coil of rope over her shoulder, humming the same steady line you heard in the darkness of the Black Week. The keeper gestures you inside. The ark smells of cedar, pitch, and stored breath. It is a house that decided to learn a second language. You duck beneath a crossbeam and step onto the deck as the first thick push lifts the hull a finger's breadth. Somewhere in your ribs, a quiet latch clicks open. Lines fly from hands to rings, knots bite down and remember their training. Above, the bull-headed prow looks forward with lapis calm. Below, water slides into the launch channels and shrugs the cradle aside. For a brief wobbling heartbeat, the ark forgets the floor exists. And then it rides. You look out through the great doorway as the chamber becomes a cave with a river for a tongue. Ropes snake from the beams to the upper terrace. Men on the steps lean back in perfect chorus, feeling for the river's mood through their palms. The gong sounds twice. The answer comes from the key. 3 drum beats and a plume of smoke. The signal script of a city that has rehearsed catastrophe like a festival. Outside, streets unwrap into inlets. The market's reed awnings turn into sails whether they like it or not. Fruit stalls bump and spin, baskets of onions becoming buoys for a few comic, alarming seconds before someone snatches them aboard a passing barge. A line of roof beams, still obedient to each other, no longer obedient to walls, slides down an alley and kisses the side of a statue's plinth. The statue tilts, considers, and decides to travel. The water, with the patience of empire, persuades an entire courtyard that it was always a raft. Mainstream fact steadies your feet. In southern Mesopotamia, houses often used reed and mud brick over wooden frameworks, with courtyards, platforms, and mat roofs. In extreme floods, lighter structures can break free. Reed bundles float, door planks become bridging boards. Even small shrines mounted on processional barges could be towed. The marsh tradition that lasts into modern times proves it. Reed houses, boats for streets, a culture that treats water as an inconvenient cousin who won't stop visiting. The tablets weren't being poetic when they listed floors walking and walls that remember the river. A shout from portside, "Statue!" You turn as four men in knee-deep surge wrestle a carved figure onto a raft of doors lashed together with clotheslines and optimism. The god wears the old horned crown and a chipped half-smile. When they push off, the raft swings wide and bumps your hull with the soft thud of one dynasty greeting another. Someone makes a sign against knocking divinity, then apologizes to the statue out loud. The statue, being stone and professional, refuses to take offense. Your goat, the reed chewer of construction fame, is already on board, of course. It has chosen a spot beside a jar of dates and a coil of excellent rope, which it pretends not to notice. The keeper steers you around this delicate triangle like a veteran diplomat. Joke 1. If the goat ever learns knots, you're retiring. From the high terrace, a man throws a line, and your crew answers. Along the long steps, other arcs and barges hold their places like beads on a string. Between them, the city unthreads and floats, a rooftop with its smoke hole still breathing, a baker's oven rafted on its own warming stones, a row of copper pans riding belly up like lazy turtles. A boy kneels on the prow of a reed canoe and scoops up a runaway loaf with the pride of a fisherman, landing something with better crust. Wind licks rain into your face, and the sky presses lower until the ziggurat's top tier becomes an island in a gray sea. The blind-eyed singer steps to the foredeck and lets her song lengthen, the braid at her shoulder swaying like a slow pendulum. Rowers dip their oars on the downbeat. Drums answer from somewhere behind a drowned alley. You realize the city has opened its archive of muscle memory. It is reading from a script written in rope and rhythm. On the starboard side, a procession barge slides by, one of those festival vessels you saw carved on the quay panels. Its stern is heavy with a shrine of cedar, bitumen sealed and bound with bronze strapping. Its prow, shaped like a crescent, holds a brazier still burning in the rain. Priests stand inside the shrine, hands raised, dust pale and serious. With their house now a boat, the gods continue the workday. There's a moment, every flood has it, when the water forgets to climb and decides to roam instead. Streets become slow rivers drawing new maps. The river becomes a patient cartographer, persuading blocks to try life in different neighborhoods. A row of palms glides past like courtiers trading seats. And there, like a fable proving itself by showing up, a whole line of vendor stalls drifts intact, still in formation, awnings taut against the rain, a floating marketplace that refuses to admit schedules have changed. Someone buys a handful of garlic. Someone else haggles about a jar of oil. History will call this resilience. The moment calls it Tuesday. Quirky, yes, and the fringe climbs aboard with wet sandals. One tablet in your keeper's chamber swore that during a great flood, lights moved under the water like the eyes of fish, guiding boats around submerged obstacles. Phosphorescent algae, lamp spill reflected on silt, or the mind's need to find agency in the chaos. The same fragment adds that a winged thing perched on the prow of a temple barge and refused to leave until the waters fell. A heron would do, stubborn, long-legged with the right dramatic sense. But the line that makes you grin says the bird scolded anyone who spoke too loudly. Joke 2. First recorded noise complaint comes from a waterfowl. Your ark noses into an avenue that used to be a market for cloth. Bolts of dyed wool, woven tight, hold together well enough to raft themselves. People step from wool to door, to rope to deck, with the focus of acrobats, carrying children, jars, a stubbornly potted fig tree that someone refuses to abandon. The keeper gestures you to the stern and points. The ziggurat tether lines draw tight, then slack, like the city's pulse. He reads them as if they're sentences and says, almost conversationally, "South Sluice gave, East Quay holds." Historians still argue whether reports of floating districts are metaphor, a way of saying neighborhoods dispersed, or literal accounts of architecture that briefly behaved like ships. The archaeology hands you both, collapsed mud brick walls scoured by current, but also concentrated mats of mixed debris, where courtyards and roofs rode together before settling. Somewhere in a deeper layer than you'll reach tonight, A scholar will find a ring of household objects far from their home quarter and write a paper with too many footnotes and not enough sleep. A sudden jolt. Your hull kisses something tall just under the surface. The steering oar bites. The map painted on its blade saves you from a second less polite conversation with a statue's plinth. The rowers shift their weight together, and the ark slides free. A jar rolls. The goat eyes it with academic interest. You intercept with heroic timing. Joke 3, you prevent the first goat drunk on sesame oil incident in recorded history. Applause optional. Past the temple quarter, the city thins. Here the flood has a longer stride. A line of granaries raised on short piers stands half-drowned and stubborn. The tops of their doors breathe like lungs as each wave lifts and lowers the threshold. Men leap from barge to lintel and pry at shutters. A woman on your deck counts aloud, the cadence sure and practical. One jar for the rowers, one for the old quarter, one for the key. She ties clay tags to the handles with wet string, and the keeper nods as if to say, the flood can rearrange streets, but not fairness. Far out where the city loosens into fields, a tiled platform rides high with 4 statues strapped upright, faces turned toward the horizon. For a blink, they look like passengers on a solemn holiday, stone tourists refusing to slouch. You think of the line upstairs, what the waters carried away, and realize it also means who. Rain slackens to a cool curtain. The sky lifts enough that color creeps back into things. The cedar's red, the lapis eye, the green sting of a reed fresh broken. The blind-eyed singer changes mode. The drums follow her. Rowers lean, breathe, lean, breathe. A heron paces your gunwale like a petty officer doing inspection and decides not to scold. You take the long view for a minute, standing as high as the deck allows. The ziggurat's ropes run like harp strings, taut from terrace to hull. The arcs sit in a wide oval around the temple mound, with smaller craft tucked between like notes in a chord. Around them, streets-turned rivers carry roofs, ovens, shrines, pets, and, inexplicably, a flawless basket of pomegranates that has clearly made a pact with buoyancy. The city floats, not as one piece and not forever, but enough to matter. Enough to record, to turn into a story on clay. We did not drown at once. We learned to drift without breaking. The keeper sets a hand to the prow and closes his eyes, counting under his breath. Turn to the water, he says at last, and taps the steering oar twice. The ark eases toward a cluster of rooftops tied together like a raft of turtles. People wave, their mouths making shapes you can't hear over the river. You know the words, though. They're the same in every language. Here, help, hold. You brace a shoulder to the rail and feel the deck shift, alive and obedient. The flood has stopped pretending to be a rumor. It is a fact. It is a road. And you, goat included, are already learning its grammar. The city hums in your bones, not with the bustle of a market or the clang of a smith's yard, but with something low and slow, a shared vibration that seems to rise from every soaked wall, every shifting deck plank. The keeper says nothing, but you notice his eyes flick often toward the horizon, as if measuring the mood of the flood by the color of the clouds. On the terrace above, someone lights a long torch, its flame bending sideways in the breeze. The scent drifts down, resin and pitch, and instantly you're hungry. The air has that strange quality of before a feast, bread baking, meat roasting, oil crackling in clay pans. It makes no sense. Much of the city is underwater. But then you remember the last tablet you read in the keeper's chamber, lines that spoke of the night of plenty before the silence. Fact first, to anchor yourself. In ancient Mesopotamia, festivals were as much about survival as celebration. Before long journeys or dangerous seasons, communities feasted to strengthen bonds and share resources. Even in times of disaster, records suggest they made room for ritual meals. Food was not just sustenance, it was a declaration. We are still here. And now, the city is making that declaration. You drift closer to a large platform, a rooftop, now afloat, tethered to the ziggurat's outer wall. People have arranged clay lamps along its edges, their reflections trembling in the water. In the middle, a long reed mat is covered with bowls of dates, figs, flatbreads, lentils cooked with onions. Someone has hauled up amphorae of beer, their wax seals just broken. Children dart between the adults, splashing through shallow pools on the roof as if the whole arrangement is perfectly normal. The keeper waves you toward a gap between two moored barges. You tie up, and immediately a woman with a woven crown of rushes presses a warm piece of bread into your hand. It's sweet, dusted with crushed sesame, and you take a bite before realizing you haven't tasted anything but rain for hours. Quirky detail for your mental notebook. One clay tablet from the old Babylonian period records a peculiar flood banquet where the menu included roasted locusts dipped in date syrup. Whether it was a delicacy or desperation food, no one agrees. Tonight, thankfully, you see no insects on the platters, just spiced lamb and bowls of sour yogurt to cut the fat. You sit on the edge of the roof with your feet dangling over the water. The goat, yes, that goat, is already working the crowd, nose deep in a pile of vegetable scraps. Someone has looped a necklace of dried figs around its neck like a badge of honor. You'll never get it off. Joke 1. Congratulations, you now own the only goat in recorded history with better jewelry than you. Drums start up again, slower this time, their beat rolling out like the lazy slap of waves against hulls. A blind lyre player plucks a wandering melody, and the sound carries across the flood. It's not sad exactly. More like the music is leaning on your shoulder, reminding you to breathe. The conversation around you drifts between the mundane and the impossible. Two men argue over whether the high granary will still be standing come morning. A woman swears she saw a fish as long as this boat gliding through the temple quarter. A child claims to have heard singing from beneath the water, like voices in a deep well. The keeper catches your eye and mouths the word stories. He knows that whether they're true or not, these tales are the real cargo tonight. Historians still argue whether accounts of subaqueous singing in flood myths are references to the movement of water through stone channels or purely poetic invention. There's no proof, but right now, as the drums soften and the wind hushes, you could almost believe the flood has a voice. Platters pass, beer flows. Someone starts a round dance on the driest patch of the roof, and you find yourself drawn into the circle. You step awkwardly at first, but the rhythm is forgiving. The keeper claps on the offbeat, the goat bleats in what might be time with the music, and for a few moments, you forget about the water pressing at the edges of the city. Then, as if rehearsed, the music fades. Conversations taper off. All eyes turn toward the ziggurat, where a figure in ceremonial robes stands at the highest terrace. The torchlight throws his shadow long across the water. He raises a hand, and the air stills. His voice is too far to hear clearly, but the cadence is unmistakable. A blessing, an invocation, a plea. You catch fragments, words for protection, river, return. The crowd murmurs the last lines with him. Another fact to tuck away. The Sumerians believed in a hierarchy of gods, each with their own domain, but in times of crisis, the water gods, Enki, Ea, were often invoked alongside city patrons. Rituals could blend petition and command, treating the flood as both guest and trespasser. The priest lowers his arm. For a heartbeat, nothing moves. Then the drums resume, and with them, life. Someone nudges you and hands over a wedge of cheese wrapped in a fig leaf. Someone else laughs so hard they spill beer on their lap. Joke 2, entirely unplanned. Watching a dignified elder try to stand up after sitting cross-legged for an hour, he wobbles like a temple column in a strong wind, then laughs at himself louder than anyone else. A boy brings over a small clay tablet, still damp. He presses it into your hands. It's a child's work, uneven lines, symbols clumsy but clear. You read the first line. We eat together, so the river knows we are one. The keeper leans over your shoulder and nods. He gets it, he says simply. As the night deepens, the lamps burn lower. The rain, steady but softer now, adds its own percussion to the music. The roof rocks gently with the movement of the water. People curl up under reed mats, heads resting on folded arms, conversations dwindling to murmurs. You lie back, full and warm, looking up at a sky that seems closer than it should be. And then, from somewhere far out in the dark, a single conch blast cuts through the air. It's long and low, the sound of a horn that has seen more years than the city itself. No one stirs. No one needs to. You understand without being told. It's the river's turn to speak now. Joke 3. If the river starts asking for seconds, you're moving to the mountains. You close your eyes, the conch still resonating in your chest, and let the flood's slow rocking carry you towards sleep. Somewhere in the dark, the keeper's voice threads through your drifting thoughts. Tomorrow we see if the city still floats. Dawn is a rumor you can't prove. The sky keeps its bruise, the air keeps its hush, and the water decides that maps are suggestions. You wake to a tiny wave slapping the hull with the persistence of a neighbor knocking for borrowed salt, and the ark answers by lifting one slow finger of cedar and saying, "Fine, fine, we're up." Around you, the tether lines hum like long strings tuning themselves. The blind-eyed singer stands at the prow, braid damp, voice a warm thread that stitches nervous ribs together. You lean over the rail and see what patience has done in the dark. The streets are gone, not absent, just busy being rivers. A stairwell yawns like a perfect well mouth. The current swirls inside and climbs as if remembering how to be a fountain. The market square is a lake with familiar accents. Olive oil slick here, saffron skein there, a loaf doing laps like a beetle. You watch a whole row of clay ovens drift past in a tight little fleet, oddly dignified, like elderly uncles heading out for a constitutional. Mainstream anchor for your rapidly unmoored eyes. Southern Mesopotamian cities were flat and low, knit to canals and the Euphrates by design. When floodwaters rose beyond levees, they took the straightest routes, streets, alleys, courtyards, turning the plan itself into a channel. Ziggurats, raised on high platforms, were supposed to stand above that trouble, terraces stacked like a stone refusal. But even they could become islands, their stairways licking at the lip of the gray. You see it now, the temple mound a dark ship aground, the stairs glossed with weeping bitumen. Lines run from your mast to the mid-terrace rings, from there to other arcs and barges, a web of help and geometry. Chants drift down the steps, the water hymns you heard in the Abzu's whisper room, and the lullabies assigned on duty tablets. You catch a phrase you know by now, "Do not set one hand only," and watch priests do exactly that, one hand to prayer, one to rope. Temple is warehouse, sanctuary is command post, the city breathes through both lungs. A boy on a reed canoe sprints past, paddle flicking, voice carrying, "East sluice holds, south key cut." The keeper grunts approval like a man who hears a good sentence and pockets it. Another runner calls, "Granary doors breathing," which is correct and horrifying. You can see them in the distance, the raised storehouses lifting and settling as each swell licks their thresholds. Men ride lintels like porpoises, heaving sacks toward barges tied below. A woman on your deck counts in that rock-steady way again, tying clay tags to handles that drip like small, exhausted moons. The ark noses into the broad way toward the ziggurat's lowest stair, and your goat, deck mascot, rope critic, would-be gourmand, sets itself as ballast beside the jar of dates it still pretends not to covet. You step around this complicated triangle with a grace you didn't know you owned. Joke 1. If the flood writes a gratitude tablet later, it will thank goat for not eating the mooring line. Closer now, the stair uncurls. Each step is a thin brown lip. The water presses a kiss to one, then climbs to taste the next. People crowd the balustrade, passing bundles from shoulder to shoulder. Scroll cases, priestly drums, bread jars, a single ridiculous bronze mirror that refuses to stay humble in catastrophe. The blind-eyed singer modulates, and her voice finds the climb built into the stairs. Drummers pick up her lean, and a rhythm steps with the water, not against it. You feel your own breath fall into the count. A curious, fringe-bright tidbit tugs your sleeve. Small clay luck boats, the size of a fist, ride the stair edges, tied with hair-thin cords to copper nails. Families keep them in rafters for ordinary seasons. During flood, they set them to float beside the real world in miniature, a whispering insurance. Some swear the cords twitch before the big surges. Others say they are just toys that remember their owners better than most gods do. You raise an eyebrow. The keeper pretends not to see it. His mouth is too busy, not quite smiling. On the terrace, a priest holds a bird cupped in ringed fingers. He tosses it. It arcs, a wet flick of wings, and is gone into the gray. Another bird waits in the hands of a boy in a robe 2 sizes too big. You know the scene's older cousin, Utnapishtim, releasing dove, swallow, raven to test the waters. The oldest stories aren't shy about sensible ideas. The boy flinches when the second bird claws at wind. It whirls, lands 2 terraces below, then lifts, confused, stubborn, alive. Historians still argue whether such release rites were symbolic reenactment or genuine reconnaissance, and you decide anyone who has ever checked a weather app, a window, and a knee all at once understands the value of redundancy. Your hull rubs the stair with a shiver that travels into your legs. The keeper calls a turn. The steering oar takes a long, sure bite, and you settle clean alongside. Hands, ropes, breath, all the same doing. From up here, the city wears a single expression, jaw set, eyes bright, humor intact. Someone down the steps bellows, "Who tied this like a drunk?" And someone else answers, "Your mother." The flood doesn't make people stop being themselves. It just frames them larger. You help heave a shrine chest across the gunnel, heavy as a choice. Inside, tablet bundles wrapped in waxed linen, a set of bronze measures, a small, ridiculous wooden lion whose teeth have handled 1,000 children's fingers at festival time. The keeper taps the tablet bundle as if greeting an old friend, then slides it under a beam as if it were a child who needs a nap. A pulse comes through the tether web, not muscle, not wind. The ropes draw tight, then slack, then tight, a breath you can measure. The blind-eyed singer's chin lifts. She hears it first and counts under her breath. The drums answer a hair before the swell arrives. The stair takes a deep, messy kiss. Water slaps the second terrace hard enough to make your jaw ache. Then it slides back, sulking, and leaves behind a fringe of reeds draped along the balustrade like river jewelry. Joke 2, congratulations, the ziggurat is now accessorized. The keeper glances at the sky and mutters, "South feeder." You think of the Abzu pegs and their beats, of the bowl of smoke bending east in the whisper room, of how the city has been practicing this conversation since it learned to make bricks. Between drags of breath, you hear those old instructions walking around. Seal again, count, listen, do not set one hand only. A man wades by with a box of tablets held over his head like a sacred loaf. You lean and take it, the weight wet and specific, and you think of the scribe upstairs who used to smirk. He's here too, hair pasted to his skull, grin somehow still irreverent. He slaps the box and says, "Try not to drop the words," and your hands take him at his own earnest joke. Farther out, the shrine barge with the cedar house passes, its brazier still working. Flames look ridiculous in rain until you realize the site is for people, not gods. It says, "We're in the same story, still, even now." The priest's mouths move. The words are old, but the grammar surprises you. Commands and petitions braided. Come back, stand down, rise here, fall there. Historians still argue whether such chants were meant to move weather or men. Watching the way oars catch the beat and shoulders square, you decide the answer is yes. A long, low rumble rolls up the avenue, not thunder, structures surrendering. You turn and see a whole facade shrug loose and fold forward with the mildest politeness, as if bowing out of a conversation. The wave that comes at you is tired but committed. Your hull lifts, slides, squeals over stone, and the goat, adorned, ridiculous, braces like a seasoned mariner. You put a palm on the jar of dates because some priorities are universal. Joke 3, if you save the dates will save you. That's science. The water keeps doing its ancient boring miracle. Go where it can, stay where it must, insist on being itself. The city answers with its own. Tie, lift, count, sing, hand, hand, hand. Somewhere a baby starts crying and then, instantly, stops. The sound swallowed by a dozen aunts who appear out of rain like conjured comfort. Somewhere a heron stands on a door and watches the world go by with hostile interest. Somewhere the bull-headed prow stares forward and refuses to blink. You look up at the top terrace. The priest with the birds has one left. He strokes its neck as if apologizing in advance and throws. It climbs, wobbles, rights itself, and flies straight into the gray like a sentence that knows where it's going. The crowd's breath follows it, a held thing. When it disappears, they release the air back into the day and return to their ropes. By midday, if it is midday, the water's temper shifts. Not down, not up, but sideways, testing the city's new shapes. The keeper reads the tug like a book, taps the oar twice, and the ark swings her nose toward a cluster of roofs that have chosen solidarity. You spot the mirror again, catching a struggling sun and throwing it back at the sky with petty defiance. Good mirror. Carry on. The chants slip into lower gears, exhausted but steady. The drums answer. Your arms know the work now. Your feet belong to a deck. Your voice, without asking permission, hums along with the singer. The flood has swallowed streets, tested stairs, licked at the godhouse doors. What the tablet said would happen is happening, and somehow the part that surprises you is not the water, but the way a city keeps being itself while it floats. You set your shoulder to the next crate. The rope creaks, the ark breathes, the river replies. The ziggurat wears its shining collar of reeds and does not bow. Above the gray lid, a lighter smudge hints at a sun cleaning its hands. Not yet, not yet. But you feel the hinge somewhere find a new center. You're not sure what to call that feeling, so you settle for this. The city still chants, therefore the city still is. You spot it first as a line that shouldn't move. The water ahead is a flat pewter plate, then a seam flexes across it, pushes a ripple, and resolves into a back the color of wet bark. It slides under your bow and is gone. You hold your breath like a superstition, then laugh at yourself for maybe 3 seconds until the seam returns, followed by a whiskered face the size of a shovel. It blinks at you, solemn as a judge, then sculls away toward the drowned date palms with the lazy competence of something that has never once paid attention to a human emergency. River dog, the keeper says, meaning otter, meaning it belongs here more than you do. It vanishes between 2 drifting roof beams and leaves bubbles that look almost cheerful. A dark blade cuts the water to starboard, then another, then a scatter, as if a handful of knives had learned to swim. The blind-eyed singer steps to the railing and laughs, low. Gar, she says, hungry. The long-nosed fish slice along the hull, and, for a tense, foolish heartbeat, you imagine them as sabers with opinions. They are only fish, but the mind wants stories when it's floating. You pass them a story anyway by not dangling your fingers. Mainstream anchor for your nervous system. The marshes and rivers of Mesopotamia swarmed with carp, catfish, and long-beaked gar. Birds crowded the reed beds. Heron, stork, ibis, boar rooted the margins. Jackals patrolled the edges. Lions padded these plains long enough to earn a place on royal reliefs. Cylinder seals and plaques give that living catalog: fish, fowl, bull, goat, beside gods and kings. When the waters rise, the catalog reorders itself. Fish raid courtyards, dogs learn new strokes, roof doves fail their flight checks and try humility. You are watching a reshuffle older than your tongue. On the next surge, a door floats by with its own passengers, 3 kittens clinging like burrs, ears flat, eyes huge. The goat, jewelry still intact, priorities unchanged, stares in horrified empathy. The keeper leans from the rail and hooks the door with a pole. A boy scoops the cats aboard and tucks them into his cloak. Someone mutters a prayer that mostly consists of apologies for laughing. You promise the universe you will never badmouth cats again. Joke 1, you absolutely will, just not today. A reed fence sideswipes the hull, shivers, and lets loose a brown braid. Snakes. You freeze, remembering the tablet that listed things the waters bring with an alarming lack of punctuation. The first snake coils, chooses dignity over aggression, and rides out the bump with the poise of a courtier on a barge. The keeper touches your elbow. They're looking for dry, he says. So are we. Consider yourselves cousins until proven otherwise. You adjust your definition of neighbor. The air above the river blooms with wings. Ibis like walking questions, herons stalking the current with offended seriousness, swallows stitching frantic cursive just under the lid of cloud. Then a silent shadow passes, and every smaller wing folds. A raptor floats there as if the sky had grown a thought. It tilts one pinion, regards your deck, and decides you are too complicated. You breathe again. Quirky makes an entrance you didn't schedule. A man in a skiff paddles past with inflated goatskins tied along his hull, bobbing like fat moons. He grins at your expression. Kellic, he says. The word sits right, even if your mouth hasn't practiced it. Rafts of skins carried freight down these rivers for ages. Today they carry a whole family, 3 baskets of dates, and a grandmother who keeps whacking the skins with a spoon like she can tune them. The raft hums at a pitch the blind-eyed singer matches for 3 bars, smiling to herself. You suspect instruments are everywhere if you want them. Another shadow, lower. A dog paddling hard, snorting river, a gourd tied clumsily under its chest as a float. A boy dives off a roof raft, shoulders the dog, gets them both onto your deck by inventing a new kind of scramble. He sets the dog down, pats the gourd, pats the dog again. Same rhythm, same gratitude. You think of the tablet about "do not set one hand only" and decide this counts. A rumble, different from the building fold sound, rolls from under the hull, a bass that loosens the rope's catenary and makes your knees vote for caution. The water ahead bulges and sighs. Then it births something you don't want, a tangle of reed stalks, roof timbers, a broken trough, and, hooked dead center, a boar, tusks pale as moons, legs bicycling in a slow, furious dream. It hauls its chest onto the wreckage, stares with prehistoric offense, and roars like a cupboard full of pans. The blind-eyed singer does not blink. She sings lower. The boar calms by imperceptible degrees, a ritual that no tablet remembered to write down, a voice weighing more than fear. Behind you, someone points and whispers, not at the boar, but beyond it. There, riding the long coil of flood where the fields used to be, a dark spine purls and drops, larger than the otter, slower than fish. The word crocodile wants to climb into your mouth because your brain knows empires that had them. But the keeper shakes his head before you try it on. Marsh lizard, he says, far cousin. Don't give it a bigger story than it owns. He means monitor, and it is enough to make your skin shift. Historians still argue whether travelers' tales of crocodiles in southern marshes were import, imagination, or misread sightings of big lizards and bigger fear. You decide you're satisfied not filing a definitive report. A boy on the terrace above cries out and points at the water under the ziggurat's shadow. You follow his finger and see lights, thin, wavering, a handful only, moving like thoughts under the surface. Fireflies pressed into glass is what your mind offers, wrong but unembarrassed. The keeper watches long enough to choose boredom, which is an answer. Oil lamps overturned, phosphorescence filming an eddy, or a story testing for a mouth. The flood has enough teeth. You let this one keep its glow. A cylinder seal impression smeared onto a wet clay pot makes its rounds. A messenger hands it to rowers who peer and pass it on. The engraving shows a figure in a fish cloak, human legs beneath, carrying a tablet toward a city gate. The Apkallu, old fish sages of Mesopotamian memory, move like this through clay and story, part human, part water, all instruction. They come with floods, someone says with certainty that owes nothing to science and everything to inheritance. The blind-eyed singer touches the seal with one thumb and returns to her rope. The fringe leans in, dripping. A tablet from a back shelf in the keeper's court once claimed that during a great rising, a man with gills climbed a stair and spoke 10 names no one could write. The note below adds dryly, or else it was a priest in a net with lamp smoke. Both versions live because both serve the same need, to make knowledge come on feet, not vapors. Historians still argue whether the fish-cloaked figures represent mythic teachers, ritual performers, or protective spirits alone. The river does not stop to clarify its bibliography. On a roof raft to port sits the statue you bumped earlier, still upright, still serene, now attended by 2 small white goats who have adopted it without asking permission. One chews the reed mat at its base as if keeping entropy neat. The other looks at you and makes the kind of eye contact that drafts you into responsibility. Joke 2. Congratulations, you've been promoted to assistant to the regional goat. A long shape glides under your stern and surfaces with a wet, explosive sigh, carp the size of a misremembered childhood. It opens its mouth like a hinge and is gone. Someone swears softly, reverently. The keeper lifts his chin as if ticking a box, fish that prove themselves larger than comfort. He adds another, aloud but to himself, eel. You do not want to meet that one. The singer answers in a minor turn that suggests she doesn't either. High above, a line of cranes appears, descending from cloud edges, brightening just enough to be a rumor of blue. They choose a long moment to circle the ziggurat, gather their thoughts, then arrow into the south like an idea committing to itself. The deck breathes. the collective exhale of people who hadn't noticed they were waiting for that exact sign. Mainstream fact tags along softly. Temple alignments and seasonal rites watched such flights, tracked fish runs and bird paths as calendars with feathers. Survival was not ignorant of grace. And then, the oddest visitor, small, nervous, perfect, lands on your wrist. A dragonfly, bronze and azure, wings like commas correcting the river's run-on sentence. It cleans its face with symmetrical seriousness and zips off to scold a puddle. You grin without deciding to. Joke 3. If a dragonfly wants your editorial opinion during a flood, you say, "Nice work," and don't ask for revisions. The day tilts. The water's edge at the far fields shows ribs of earth for the first time. Not promise exactly, but suggestion. In the lull, the city inventories its living neighbors, cats accounted for, dogs sleeping like a punctured bellows, goats glaring at fresh rope, birds recomposing the air, fish writing their silver cursive where streets used to be. The keeper rests his palm on the bull prow and says nothing, which you recognize as his highest blessing. The blind-eyed singer hums the cadence the Abzu taught you without your consent. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and the river decides not to contradict her for a while. You lean on the rail and feel a new texture in the current, less insistence, more intention. The creatures of no record and every record slip past and keep to their errands. You look up to the terrace where a boy still holds his last bird, undecided. He grins, shakes his head, and tucks it under his robe. Not yet, he tells the sky, and the sky, astonishingly, agrees. The raft drifts closer to the mountains, if you can still call them that from here, gray silhouettes crouched like sleeping giants on the horizon. The water has lost its frantic bite, but it clings to you all the same, a damp second skin. The keeper points with his chin, not his hand. "There," he murmurs. You follow his gaze and see a cluster of shapes clinging to a jagged rise, too still for birds, too jagged for stones. As you near, they resolve into people, dozens, wrapped in mud-stiff cloth, eyes sunken but watchful. Some wave weakly, others just stand as though afraid a sudden movement will break the rock beneath them. Their sanctuary is no ziggurat, just a spit of stone that managed to keep its head above the flood. And yet, they treat it like a palace, its edges carved with frantic messages in every hand that could grip a shard of pottery or sharpened reed. One mainstream fact stands firm in your mind. In times of disaster, Sumerians and their neighbors often fled to the high places, natural ridges, shrines on elevated ground, and even artificial platforms. Archaeologists have found inscriptions in such spots, not neat and ceremonial, but rushed and desperate. Names, pleas, and fragments of prayers to gods both famous and forgotten. And here, you can see it in real time. Someone crouches at the cliff's base, scratching into the stone with something sharp, as if the act of carving could convince the waters to stop. A boy shows you a flat piece of clay, palm-sized, still damp. Pressed into it is a bird, feathers sketched in hurried lines, beak open as if crying. "To tell them what came," he says simply. You nod, though you know clay this wet will crumble before the next sun. Still, the act matters. The story is in the doing. There's an old woman seated near the cliff's edge, hair plastered silver against her skull. She watches the horizon as though she might see the god Enlil himself marching over the water to apologize. Fringe whispers say survivors sometimes claim to see such visions, gods pacing the sky, pointing the floods where to go, or standing in the rain with arms folded like disapproving parents. Historians still argue whether such visions were poetic flourishes, hallucinations from exhaustion, or deeply rooted oral tradition taking on the shape of the divine. You don't press her for which version she sees. Her eyes are busy measuring something only she can see. The keeper unloads a small bundle from the raft, bread wrapped in reed leaves, 2 skins of water, a clay lamp. The exchange is wordless. You note how their hands shake when they pass the food inward, breaking it first for the children. You offer a joke about portion size, light enough not to sting. "Guess I'll get the crusts then." A few chuckles spark, brittle but real. Scattered on the high ground are shrines, some no larger than a cooking pot turned upside down, others as tall as your hip. Offerings sit in them, rescued from the flood, a small bronze amulet, a polished shell, a loaf turned rock hard. One shrine has a single fish placed on it, still wet, as though the giver believed the gods might prefer fresh. The blind-eyed singer hums a note and leaves a tiny bead of lapis lazuli on the altar. The air up here is different, less humid, but thick with the musk of survival. And the wind has its own voice now, sliding over the ridge and curling into the shrines. It reminds you faintly of the temple hymns, minus the structure, as if the mountain itself were an old priest too tired to stand but unwilling to stop the service. You sit with one of the carvers, a youth whose hands are covered in cuts from chipping stone. "What are you writing?" you ask. He grins without looking up. "A list." The word carries no humor, but you give it some anyway. "Of things you've lost?" He shakes his head. "Of things I still have." You don't ask to read it. You already know it starts with breath. Joke one, whispered to yourself. You'd add, "boat that hasn't sprung a leak yet." From this height, the floodplain is an unbroken mirror, clouds painted on its skin. You spot the tops of palm trees, bent like quills in a half-written word. A goat skull bobs past far below, its horns oddly regal in the sunlight. In a pool of still water near the ridge's base, you catch the reflection of the ziggurat's tip, impossibly far away. It seems closer here than it ever did in the city, as if the flood has stitched all distances into one flat sheet. A man sits apart from the others, cradling a clay tablet wrapped in cloth. He unwraps it just enough to show a corner, lines etched in deliberate, steady hands. The keeper nods at it, a kind of silent respect. "High place records," he explains softly. "Sometimes they rewrite the old stories here, so the gods hear them fresh. This tablet's edges are singed, rescued from fire before the flood. You wonder if it tells of other waters, other ridges, other hands clinging to stone. Fringe lore drifts in with the wind. Some say the high places themselves are alive, spines of an ancient being that surfaced to lift the people above the flood." The carver beside you smiles at that one. "Maybe so," he says. "If I were a mountain, I'd like to know I could do more than just be climbed." Historians still argue whether such anthropomorphic geography was symbolic metaphor or sincere belief. You decide not to settle it. The sun dips behind a band of clouds, painting the ridges in ochre and shadow. Down in the floodplain, the raft rocks gently, waiting. The keeper rises and tells you without telling you that it's time to leave. You stand, brushing stone dust from your hands, and look back at the cluster of survivors. They've already returned to their quiet work, feeding, carving, watching the horizon. You wave once, a few wave back. The old woman does not, but her gaze follows you until the water takes the ridge out of sight. As you descend toward the raft, you hear the blind-eyed singer begin a new melody. It's slow and deliberate, each note falling like a pebble into deep water. The keeper joins in, his voice a low hum beneath hers. The sound carries back to the ridge, curling around the shrines and stone carvings, and you imagine the wind taking it up the mountain until it dissolves into the clouds. The raft pushes off, and the high place becomes a shadow behind you. Ahead, the water stretches again into uncertainty. The mountains beyond are closer now, but the current still has its own opinion about where you're going. Somewhere, out there, is the place where the waters decide they've seen enough. You're not there yet. You notice at first not as a sight but as a sound. Something unclicks. The water's breath, which has been a steady in and out for days, misses a syllable. The blind-eyed singer stops mid-hum, head tilted like a bird's. The keeper's fingers lift from the prow. A passing reed bundle kinks on a snag and instead of rising free, stays put. You lean over the gunwale. Along the far edge of the flooded field, a scalloped line appears where there wasn't one before, the modest, miraculous geometry of mud beginning to remember it as land. The arc moves without moving. The current still pulls, but it has lost that bossy tone. Puddled courtyards collapse into shallower bowls, steps reappear one lip at a time, glossy and sullen, roof rafts settle, testing the patience of their new personalities. The ziggurat sheds its collar of reeds like jewelry taken off after a long day. On the terrace, priests lean on rails and look as if someone finally set down a heavy jar that had been balanced on everyone's shoulder at once. A heron plants its ridiculous feet on a stone finial and refuses to leave, as if to prove the day's theme is stubbornness. You can feel the ark's draft lighten, barely, but it's there. The goat registers the same truth with a sophisticated maneuver. It lies down and sighs, which is Caprine for, I have accepted the world's decision. Joke 1. You decide to adopt that exact coping mechanism for emails. A fact tethers you while the city tilts toward relief. In laments and late flood lists, the moment of recession is marked not by cheers but by inventories. Sumerian scribes recorded the day the water stood and turned, then immediately listed which granaries were opened, which shrines moved downhill, which canal mouths were to be cleared first. The tablets are allergic to triumph. They prefer checklists. On the key steps, the discipline returns like muscle memory. Runners with clay tags, women reading ration lines aloud, boys with poles knocking floating debris from mooring rings. The keeper nods toward the broad way. An eddy has become a slick, and in the slick, silt lays itself down like a bedspread. Your oar dips and bites not into free water, but into the soft insistence of new earth. The ark's ribs protest with a happy creak that sounds like old stairs after winter. You edge into deeper flow, not ready to sleep in the silt just yet. Let the river say it twice, the keeper murmurs, meaning, don't trust the first retreat. A fringe whisper sneaks in on wet feet. Some later tellings claim the waters withdraw because a word is spoken, a name of the deep carried on a conch, a formula that tells the flood which way home is. On a small tablet in the keeper's archive, a scribe has written, "We said the river's childhood name, and it blushed out of the streets. Poetic? Certainly. Useful. The conch on the terrace blows once, and the rope teams answer anyway." Historians still argue whether ritual language shaped action or only cupped it in something beautiful. Your shoulders and everyone else's seem content with both. The first genuine island appears, a square of courtyard with a tree in the middle, its leaves grease-dark and dripping. People stand on it like actors who wandered back onto a stage mid-scene. A girl drops a clay pot onto the new mud. It lands with a sigh rather than a splash. She laughs, high and breathless. Nearby, a man kneels, scoops silt into his hand, brings it to his nose, and smiles like someone who has just found his house key. He smears a thumbprint on his forehead. His wife copies him, then dabs a dot on their baby's nose, because holiness and silliness are cousins. On the city's edge, canal mouths appear as mouths do, sudden and hungry. Men plant their feet and rake with hooked poles, mud piles like bread dough along the banks. In the small pauses between pulls, you hear frogs begin to consider their options, then launch into opinions with missionary zeal. Somewhere a child shrieks at the first frog and then chases it 2 heartbeats later. Life refuses to wait for meeting minutes. The blind-eyed singer shifts her line into an older melody, one used when fields take water at the right time. It tastes like relief and work in equal parts. Rowers answer by stowing oars and picking up poles, the language of shallows. The steering oar complains less. It knows the difference between a partner and a tyrant. A statue you've escorted for half a city length has found its ground. It settles with a soft clay kiss and straightens, as if remembering it has a spine. The 2 white goats attending it shake their heads and spray diamonds of water and sunlight that wasn't there a moment ago. The goats look impressed with themselves. Joke 2. You assure them their leadership during this crisis will be remembered in official minutes. Quirky signs of recession pop like small fires across the view. A brazier that never lost its sulk goes out on its own, smoke flattening and then pulling east. A row of luck boats, the fist-sized charms tied to copper nails, list toward the stair and snag, tiny prows bumping in agreement. A fish strand on a lip of mud and discovers it has been promoted to bird. 3 children solve the philosophical problem by sliding it back into its correct sentence with squeals and wet feet. The keeper watches, mouth stern and eyes smiling. On the high terrace, the priest with the last bird makes a face that might be a prayer and sets it on his palm. He doesn't throw it. He lowers his hand and lets the thing look and decide. It hops once, then lifts and arcs toward a line of palms, rethreading their shadows onto the ground. People call after it in a sound that isn't a word. The bird returns after one slow circle and lands on the balustrade. Murmurs ripple through the terraces like textiles shaken out. You can hear the argument start already, omen of return or omen of caution. Historians still argue whether the famous bird releases in flood epics were practical scouting, theatrics, or theology with feathers. You find you don't need to pick. It is nice to be argued with by a creature that weighs as much as a pear. The ziggurat ropes slack in increments. Your whole nose is against a submerged stair you now recognize by the rhythm in your calves. People on the steps pass down the last chest from the shrine barge, bronze measures, a drum, and the ridiculous mirror that has refused to be anything but itself. The mirror flings a trembling square of light onto the water, and the water finally flings it back. Agreement achieved. A low cheer moves through the city, not a shout, more a long awe after a held breath. Immediately the counting resumes. Clay tags clack. A scribe somewhere writes, "Receded to second stair." You can see him in your head, hair still pasted, grin smaller now, wedges steady. You will forgive him anything. Debris collects in thoughtful corners, men with poles persuaded into obedient piles. Someone flips a door slab onto 2 jars and calls it a table. Bread appears without authorization. The goat considers the table's jurisdiction and compromises by stealing only the corners. Joke 3, jurisprudence has nothing on goatisprudence. You shove the steering oar once more and feel it bite clean water for the first time that isn't trying to sprint. A terrace girl leans over the balustrade and calls, "What now?" An older woman beside her answers without looking away from the receding edge. Now we find the floor. There's more in that line than instruction. There's sacrament. Find the floor, dredge the mouths, lift the fallen brick, sit the gods back onto their platforms, open the granary doors, read the water lines on the walls like rings in a tree, send runners to the high places, write everything down. A yellow band opens in the south where the lid of cloud gets bored of itself. The breeze, unsure of its role, tries out pleasant and discovers it fits. The ark pivots with an old civilized sigh and kisses the mooring ring as if nothing dramatic has happened in living memory. The bull-headed prow at last looks less like a dare and more like a mascot. You look toward the fields. What used to be horizon is now detail, ridges, furrows, the polite ruffle of water letting go. A man on a half-drowned wall plants a reed in the slop and watches it stand. He laughs at a joke none of you hear and waves the reed like a flag. If there were a tablet in your hand right now, you would carve only 2 wedges, still here. The keeper presses his palm to the prow and leaves it there longer than the gesture requires. The blind-eyed singer loosens the braid that has kept count and combs water from it with careful fingers. You feel the cadence you learned in the Abzu. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, stretch into 8, then 9, then 10, as if time has decided to resume its original shape. The river does not apologize. It never does. It simply revises the sentence. The city is not in the water. The water is in the city. Now the water is at the edge where it belongs, with opinions noted. On the terrace, a child drags a stick along a wet step and watches it leave a line. The line holds. You watch too, because this is the new tablet, and it is being written in mud and relief more surely than anything baked in a kiln. Somewhere downwind, someone opens a jar of sesame, and the smell announces a future in which the kitchen remembers itself. Someone else laughs the laugh of a person who slept 3 hours and woke up alive. The conch does not blow. It does not need to. The flood has chosen to leave, and the city, ridiculous, stubborn, and spared, chooses to stay. The keeper insists on walking now. His knees pop like the hull did when it first touched stone, but he ignores it, stepping onto the newly revealed stair with the solemnity of a man greeting an old friend. You follow, boots sinking slightly into the slime, each pull leaving behind a perfect impression that will dry and crack into memory by tomorrow. The blind-eyed singer trails behind, her voice low and steady, not a lament anymore, but something more domestic, the kind of tune you hum while sweeping. Above, the ziggurat's once-drowned terraces shine dark as obsidian under the sun's first full return. Priests move in careful lines, carrying relics down from the high sanctuaries. You watch one cradle a copper lamp still wet inside, its wick bloated from days of soaking. He tips it, pours out the flood's last gulp, and mutters to himself in a tone you've only heard at funerals. A historical fact from the keeper's lips slips into the scene like it belongs there. In the city's oldest archives, every major flood is followed by what they called the reseating of the gods. Each idol, each sacred vessel, each ceremonial drum was restored to its rightful place, and only then could trade resume. Without that ritual, no market could legally open, no marriage could be declared, no verdict pronounced. It wasn't bureaucracy. It was the spine of their world. A fringe whisper rides in on the breeze. Some Sumerian flood stories hint the gods themselves wandered during the waters, roaming the currents like displaced nobles, looking for the right street to return to. Certain clay shards even record arguments between statues, each claiming a more important temple than the other. Whether that was satire, religious drama, or a clerk's boredom, historians still argue. But you can't help picturing it now. Divine squabbles bobbing past rooftops like royal ducks. On the street below, a boy squats to rescue a fish stranded in a shallow gutter. His mother shouts that it's cursed, but the boy grins and sets it free into a deeper pool. You catch his eye. He shrugs as if to say, "It's seen enough." You believe him. The keeper leads you toward a small plaza you've only known as a sheet of water. The stone benches re-emerge, slime-slick but unbroken. Carvings along their backs are suddenly legible, rows of wedge-shaped script describing flood levels from generations past. He runs his finger along one and taps twice at a line barely higher than your knee. That, he says, was a gentle year. You can't help laughing. Gentle is not the word you'd use for any flood. Joke 1. By that logic, a hurricane is just an assertive breeze. As the plaza drains, the air changes. Less brine, more earth. The scent is deep and metallic, the perfume of new mud. Vendors begin staking their spaces even before the stones are dry. A woman sets a tray of onions on a still wet table, claiming the spot before anyone else can. Someone else strings fish to dry in the sun, the silver skins flashing like impatient coins. Near the eastern gate, you find what the keeper clearly brought you to see. A single intact flood tablet wedged halfway into a recess in the wall. The edges are softened, but the text remains. He brushes the mud away with his sleeve. "Read it," he says, though you both know you can't. Still, you trace the indentations with your fingertips, and the shapes feel less like words and more like the rhythm of water against a hull. He translates loosely, murmuring, "The flood took what it knew and returned what it forgot." You feel that sentence settle into you the way silt does, slowly, filling every hollow until it's part of the foundation. As you step away, the fringe details return. Someone points toward the river mouth, where odd shapes drift, half flood debris, half mystery. One looks like a carved prow, another like a jawbone of something too big to live in these waters. The keeper squints but doesn't chase. "Some things leave better than they arrive," he says. By afternoon, sunlight hardens the mud enough for carts to roll. Children skip in the shallows, splashing each other in mock floods, their laughter ricocheting off walls still damp. A goat, perhaps the same stubborn one, tests the strength of a drying step, finds it wanting, and bleats as if insulted. Joke 2. You suspect the goat will file a formal complaint with the city council. The blind-eyed singer takes a seat near the plaza's center, braiding her hair with deliberate care. She hums something lighter now, something that makes the goats pause as if even they need to listen. The keeper joins her, resting the tablet across his knees like an old pet. He tells you quietly about one debate that still rattles scholars. Did the flood stories exaggerate to warn future generations, or did they understate the disaster to avoid panicking them? No one knows. The truth is as slippery as the fish darting in the receding pools. But he grins, leaning back against the bench. "Either way," he says, "the tablets made sure we'd keep talking about it." You tilt your head toward the plaza's edge. The last puddle there has shrunk to a circle no bigger than your hand, and in its mirror, the sky is startlingly clear. You realize it's the first time you've seen blue without a frame of gray in days. And for some reason, that quiet color feels more miraculous than the flood's retreat itself. Joke 3. If this were a modern disaster, someone would already be selling bottled post-flood air for twice the price of onions. The keeper notices your smile and pats the tablet. "Almost time," he says. You don't ask for what, because in a city learning to breathe again, the answer could be anything. You return when the reeds are brittle and the wind remembers every alley by name. The city is nobody's anymore and yours for an evening, the good kind of trespass. You step over a fallen lintel, slide your hand along brick that has learned to be sand again, and follow muscle memory more than map, past the plaza that once smelled of sesame and onion, past the stair your legs still know by the ache, toward the archive hollow where the keeper used to breathe dust into sentences. You walk slower than you did before. The ground seems to prefer it that way. The bull-headed prow is gone, of course. Someone carted its gilded horns off centuries ago, then lost them to a different century. The mooring rings along the terrace have sunk to their shoulders, still iron, somehow moral about it. The luck boats, those fist-sized charms that once bobbed and tattled, are only tiny green scars on copper nails. But the nails haven't lost the trick of catching late light and throwing it back like a stubborn rumor. You smile without permission. You trudge into what used to be the boat hall and is now a long echo. The floor remembers the channels that once ferried flood into launch, their outlines hold like erased lines in a school tablet, faint but insolent. On the far wall, the shadow of the steering oar appears where sun and dust agree for 5 minutes a day that memory deserves paint. The scent here is complicated. Old cedar, baked clay, a whisper of pitch that outlives its own name, and the thin sweetness of weeds that have decided to call themselves garden. Mainstream fact patters, in like cautious rain. Most of the flood stories we know today were copied and recopied across centuries. Sumerian versions about Ziusudra, later Akkadian tablets naming Utnapishtim, fragments from Nippur and Sippar, and those famous tablets in a king's library far to the north. The words traveled because clay travels surprisingly well when it breaks and hides. They were not one scribe's fever. They were a chorus that learned to survive inside ruins, under roads, in filled dirt. You are walking through their favorite hiding place. You find a shard near your sandal, the curve of it still kind to the fingers. Its surface carries 2 clean wedges and a smear where a thumb slid before the clay dried. The thumbprint is ridiculous and devastating. You can feel its quickness. A scribe late to dinner, a student rushing to catch a teacher's line, a child pressed into the mud with ceremony because everyone knows fingerprints are little thunderbolts you can keep. Quirky tidbit sneaks a grin from your pocket. In some houses far from temples, old broken tablets were reused as pot stands or door shims. History makes decent furniture. You tuck the shard on a ledge as if it asked for a view. The Abzu chamber below is only breath now. You lower yourself toward it on stone that sighs as if your weight were a favorite story retold too often. Down there, the water has taken a vow of silence, but you can still hear 7 pegs if you put one ear to the damp and pretend. The copper ladle is a crescent stain on the niche. The little clay fish, those hollow-mouthed ears, have mostly dissolved, but one remains, leering at you with the optimism of a survivor who refuses to update its worldview. You nod back. Still listening, you whisper, and the room lets you have that. You climb, knees explaining each step in their courteous indoor voice, and reach the terrace where the mirror once bullied the sun. A sliver of polished bronze lies half swallowed by grit, dull except for one flirtatious edge that refuses extinction. You brush it with your sleeve, and for a moment the sky closes its hand around your face and hands it back brighter. Joke 1. If anyone asks why your eyes water, you'll tell them it's bronze dust syndrome, and not because a scrap of metal just offered you a 5-second resurrection. Wind moves along the stair in slow chords. It knows the lullabies the blind-eyed singer taught this hill. You stand where she stood and count without thinking. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The number keeps the bones steady, the way it did when water wore the steps like a necklace. Do not set one hand only, you tell the empty view, and you mean keep balancing prayer with shovel, poetry with rope, science with superstition, because that was always the trick here, and because your own era is not immune to dramatic weather. Historians still argue whether the tablets remember a single shattering flood or a braid of river tantrums and sea surges stitched together until the city could tell one useful story about them. They argue whether the Black Sky Week was volcanic dust or metaphor, whether the Ark was a reed cathedral or a practical barge that became legend because it worked. The debate walks beside you, civilized as an old neighbor, and you give it your water bottle. In return, it points out a detail you'd have missed, a tiny tally line inside a pillar's shadow, the flood height of some year whose name nobody has forced into a textbook, but whose mud wrote the wall honestly. On your way back down, you pass the bench where flood levels are carved in schoolroom neat. The lowest gentle mark scratches at your shins. Above it, deeper cuts speak of seasons when the river practiced cruel memory. Someone, maybe the smirking scribe you learned to trust, added a line much higher with a note that reads, "Never again, please." The wedge for please is so polite, you want to hug it. Joke 2, you consider carving under it, second it, but decide history doesn't need your handwriting. The goat? Oh, the goat is immortal. Not literally, but there's a graffito in a nearby alley. A four-legged lump with spectacular horns, a necklace of dots, and a wedge that means mine. You laugh too loud for stones. It turns out the flood hero of your personal epic found a permanent job on someone's wall. And honestly, you've seen worse saints. At last, you stand at the gate where the city used to pour itself into the plain every morning. Dust walks past like an experienced guide. You look back. The ziggurat keeps its profile, neither apologizing for its gods nor auditioning for new ones. The terraces hold birds the way hands hold warmth after a cup. The archive sleeps in its shallow, but not so deep you can't wake it with a brush and a patient back. The flood tablets, whether here or in that far king's shelves, still mumble the same thesis: build before, not during. Listen first, not last. Write so someone you will never meet can feel less alone when the sky forgets how to be a sky. The wind picks up and flips a reed mat with comic timing. It lands over a small pile of potsherds like a blanket. Joke 3, the city tucks itself in and tells you that bedtime was always its best hour. Fair enough, you adjust your pack, pat your pocket for the shard you already decided not to steal and then decided to borrow without moving it, and step through the gate. Dust smudges your sandals, your timeline, your certainty. You let it. You carry forward what's easier than clay and harder than water. A rhythm, 7 beats long, that suggests how to hold a place steady while it learns to float. You don't say goodbye. You say, "I'll listen." And the city, old professional that it is, trusts you. The wind downshifts. The bright edges soften. Your shoulders remember that they're allowed to be lower than your ears. You slow your steps along the path where grasses lean like tired scribes, and the last warmth of the day hides in the sand for you to find with your soles. Behind you, the terraces shrink into simple shapes, a child's stack of blocks with the light fading between them, a place so old it has learned how to be quiet without ever being empty. The air's easier now, cooler, a little sweet, the kind of breath you offer to someone you love when they've frightened themselves with too much story. In that breath, the flood becomes a distance, and the tablets settle from voices into a murmur, into a hum, into the gentle scratch of memory filing itself where it belongs. You can still hear the blind-eyed singer somewhere, but it's as if she's moved 2 rooms away, her melody a thread you can follow if you want to sleep in the doorway. You can still feel the tug of the ropes, but the rope is a scarf now, soft and lazy on your wrist. The plane opens, and the first stars audition themselves in a sky that finally remembers the color blue belongs beneath it. The phrase you learned, "Do not set one hand only," stretches into a longer sentence. One hand to the old, one to the now, one hand to the river's ancient grammar, one to the weather app you pretend not to check, one hand to prayer, one to practice. The balance is not heavy. It's a cradle, and you are rocked by it without having to pretend you're not. If you glance back, the ziggurat will look smaller than it deserves, as all great things do when they're doing their job. If you close your eyes, you will see the rope web thrumming without urgency, a city held like a harp by its own people, and farther out, the high places keeping watch with the stubborn patience of stones that have already seen everything you can imagine. Let your jaw loosen, let your breath lengthen. Imagine a palm pressed lightly to your back, not to push, but to remind you there is a back and it's allowed to rest. Somewhere, a goat is not eating a rope. Somewhere a child is scratching a lucky boat into wet clay. Somewhere an old scribe quits smirking long enough to point out a spelling and then falls asleep in his chair. It is all right to join him. The river will keep its beat without you for a while. Now, let the floor of the world find you. Let the dust settle, not as exile, but as comfort. The story knows when to hush. You can dream the rest.